Hello, boys.
Hello.
How's it going?
Hi.
What's up? We got you. We got this right. I don't know if you listened a couple weeks ago, Casey, when we, like, at the end of an episode, announced to the world, Casey Dreier is coming on next week. And then we ended the show, and Jake and I were like, that wasn't next week, was it? And we're like, no, we were off by at least half a month. So you finally made it.
We're going back and forth on timing. I was getting a tooth drilled, I think, the last opportunity I had to be here. So I wisely did not come in. I couldn't move my mouth for a couple hours after that. I would not have been a good guest for you.
Would not have been great.
That's excellent. Yeah. We know it's funny because like we had talked about that date, and then near the end of our conversation, let's go for this one instead. And like I knew that, I read it, I understood it, I wrote it on the calendar, right? And then, but then just we call it show fugue when we're live like this. We just sometimes the rest of the world just blocks out. We don't really know what's going on, and we don't remember what we said, and it's like we got in show fugue. So
I'm sure millions of disappointed fans tuned in and didn't hear me the following week, but I'm happy.
Yeah, and the topic list is completely different, but the topic is the same since only 2 weeks ago. So
what the hell's going on? Is that the
we get new data every time, but pretty much. Yeah.
So
I should have worn my glasses. I always forget on these days when Casey's on. I gotta wear glasses.
I don't know. We got to differentiate ourselves somehow, guys. Jake and I are slowly merging into the same person.
we really are. We're not really. We're doing a kind of an anti-DEI episode here. That's basically what's going on.
NASA, give us your money.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So
too good.
That's how it goes. What do we got for drinks here today, boys? What's going on?
I got a super weird one. I don't even know why I picked this beer off of the shelf. I think it's called Little Treasures, and it just has all of these like weird rubber duck and like seagulls and lobsters and these campers and then like little sailor guys over here and Moed.
There's a lot going on.
I know. I don't know what. I have no idea why I picked this one, but it's like, I don't know. It looks kind of fun. So Vitamin C Brewing from Weymouth, Mass. W-E-Y Mouth, Massachusetts. It's probably not pronounced like that at all.
No, in
Weymouth.
Massachusetts. It's probably like Muth or something.
So that's what I got. Little Treasures.
Cool.
That's it.
Awesome.
What
you got some,
Jake?
Casey?
I do actually. In honor of all that's happening, I did. So even though it's a little early, I'm just having a little bit, but I'm having some Kentucky bourbon, Woodford Reserve, just a little bit. To smooth the conversation today.
What is it about like a good whiskey, good bourbon, where you have like a glass like that and just the sliver makes it look like it's better quality? You're like, I can only afford this much. That's how good it is.
It might be more of a context thing. If I had a full glass of it, that wouldn't be usually not associated with an enlightened attitude towards things.
or lunch.
Or lunch, yeah.
Like, yeah, you're recently off lunch.
Yeah, this is why I'm just having a little bit. I still have a work day ahead of me, so I can't have more than a sip. But I knew today I had to have something. That's more than just my usual.
Only when you go to DC do you drink a full whiskey or bourbon glass for lunch, and then you go to the Tune Inn right by Capitol Hill, and you just drink an entire glass of whiskey.
The Hawk and Dove.
Yeah.
The old Hawk and Dove. Yes. We'll get there, yeah. Which we'll be there in less than a month at our day of action, and on March 23rd and 24th in Washington D.C.
Wow,
is that too early for a plug?
No, not at all.
It's foreshadowing. Now, when you talk about it later, it's not weird.
Yes, exactly.
It's not manufactured. It's just.
Can I say something?
relevant.
I was at the Everyday Astronaut Space Gala Awards last month in Austin. And I ran into the owner of Starbase Brewing, who said that he had heard me on this show mention that I would happily accept his beers if he wanted to send them, and said that he had internalized that, and he came up to me and mentioned that, which I was very appreciable of. I have not received them though since I've gotten back.
That's probably because I desperately owe him a text back. I think that's why. Like,
he was very nice.
Jake and I drastically owe him some communication, so he might have cut everyone out that he heard on Off-Nominal until we get back to him.
I had a chance to try his beers, which were great, and he was sponsoring part of the event, and it was a pleasure to meet him.
That's awesome.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'm still I'll just casually mention I haven't got my beers yet. tossing that out there.
I love this. I love every time Off-Nominal becomes a platform for someone to settle up an internet argument, like the time that Mark Peller called out Peter Beck for calling Centaur fat, and now you calling out Nate for not having the beers yet.
I'm not calling out. I'm just saying facts, right? I'm just no judgment. I don't expect anything. It's purely an observation. Dispassionate.
Just saying some facts.
Just saying facts.
Yeah.
Wow.
What you got, Jake? Did you get any beers down there?
No. I went anti the advice of having a full glass of anything.
Wow.
So no, I'm doing margaritas. It's pool season. Pool's opening this weekend, boys. Pool's opening this weekend. So
Congratulations.
This is a tamarind margarita, so it's got a little bit of tamarind concentrate on it. And then the real Mexican way is you put a little tahini on the outside. Lovely.
Excellent.
You're getting good at those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a very Mars-colored margarita.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at that up to your Mars One background, it looked like a little bit of Mars dust, regolith,
a little bit
on the edge there.
Got to get some brushes to sweep that off, Jake.
Something for those solar panels, right?
Yeah, all you did is just let it
Some
sit
wipers.
outside for a couple of months, and you got that nice dusting on it. I always am reminded. I'm sure you both have read Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy. Was it the religious sect that would eat the dust in red Mars to kind of consume the planet? I always think about that. That stuff it's like the cinnamon challenge, right? Because, Martian dust, there's no water, so it's all jagged and sharp. It's not rounded like our dust here. I think it would get caught in your throat. And I think, and full
like
of
the
perchlorates,
cinnamon
which are
challenge.
pretty reactive.
Yeah, it's pretty
You
bad.
like pop rocks in your mouth, except poisonous.
Yeah. Cinnamon challenge. What a shout out to the. When was that?
Yeah.
The early.
I'm with it.
The
From
late
10 years
aughts?
ago.
Yeah, I don't know.
Was
It
it
was
that long
from-
ago? I didn't think it was that long ago.
It's from the it was when Katy Perry was big, around that time.
Yeah.
I- I know my internet memes when they are written about as concerned collapse of youth civilization in the New Yorker. So that's usually a few generations removed from what the current peak is.
Oh man, we're getting old, aren't we?
Us and
dear.
Lauren Sanchez,
Yeah.
Weird
Getting old.
makeup of a girls' weekend. Gail King, Katy Perry, just putting a real mixie together there. That's the whole situation. But I don't even know where you want to start, Jake. You suggested topics. I suggested we talk about the trailer for Andor season 2 for the entirety of the show. You were gonna you put capital E executive action as a topic, Jake, and
I did.
yeah.
Well, only because Casey had been writing or doing analysis on these executive orders because they came in like pretty hot and heavy. In those first couple of weeks, there were a number of executive orders that dropped, and trying to parse out what they were, what they meant, whether they would or wouldn't have an impact, whether they would or wouldn't have an impact on space was like kind of your job a little bit for a while there. I feel like some of the posts you made were just like, oh shit, man, Casey's deep in this right now, and I want to talk to him about it. So that was the impetus for the show. So maybe we can start with that. I don't know what is the work you have been doing on that, and I don't know. I guess what did you learn? Maybe it's where we can start.
Yeah, that's certainly a big place to start. I mean, big picture, right? So President Trump has been putting out a lot of an unusually high number of executive orders. He's the head of the executive branch. These are directing the executive branch how to, policies and how to perform and decisions to make. Obviously, they're a bit more muscular than a lot of them had come previously, and a lot of them are intended to drive a lot more change within the agencies, and in a sense, almost to kind of probe and discover what the limits of presidential power are. The impacts that NASA's been having from them are, I think maybe the first kind of context is that there's nothing directed specifically at NASA, right? These are just directed at the broad executive branch, of which obviously NASA is part of. And so the agency is trying to figure out how to implement these itself. But again, it's not like targeted at the space agency, right? So obviously you have a number of them regarding DEIA activities. You have a number of them regarding kind of the more cultural stuff of gender and how to talk about that. And then there's more, in a sense, impactful, at least quantitative ones regarding spending and workforce. And, some of them have gone forward and some of them haven't. And you talk about things that trying to understand and in it, I had a whole 2 days where we thought all government grants were going to be frozen, trying to understand exactly the scope and breadth. And by the time I'd finished the analysis on that and was about to start publishing it, they rescinded it. Right. So this is like a very rapid cycle that we're trying to keep up with. The one, actually, we just had one last night. Is that the one in particular you're referring to, or is there the ones?
Probably not. I bet he doesn't know which one was happening last night.
The one from last night is more, again, I'm rather concerned about it in terms of a NASA workforce and efficiency perspective. Again, it's not directed at NASA. It's just a broad government directive, but it's, kind of asserting in a sense the DOGE team now has individual representatives kind of in place at every agency, and that this directive, in addition to kind of codifying that, adds a series of tasks for them to work with the agency head, in this case the administrator. First of which is basically freezing all travel until you can implement some system that, in a sense, requires constant written justification for every piece of travel you do, for example, to scientific conferences. Implementing a system to track all outgoing expenditures and requiring written justification for every single outward expenditure of the agency that then gets approved by the DOGE person and the administrator, or at least reviewed by it. You have a limit on government employee held credit cards to $1, so they can't spend and buy anything. And you have a number
Unless
of
it's for $1. They could buy $1.
I guess, yeah, you can buy a lot of.
Nice.
Do people still buy songs on iTunes for 99 cents? You can buy a lot of things for 99
Listen, hey,
cents.
they could sign up for our Discord or Patreon or something. Come on.
Yeah,
maybe
more expensive plan.
That's true.
100 payments for 99 cents over the years. And also, I think maybe more troubling from a big picture perspective is the directive to start planning for what is unspecified but said substantial workforce reductions in terms of identifying which staff you don't need and property, in terms of getting rid of property. Now, obviously, a lot of this is very, your perspective on this will change with different kind of political philosophy. Yeah. And, from the Planetary Society's perspective, again, we're as a nonpartisan organization, I think we've been trying to be really careful saying like what we've been worried about isn't in a sense that NASA, or we just need civil servants for the sake of having civil servants, or NASA needs to have this big footprint for the sake of having it. It's to what strategy are they executing towards, and to what, if they do need to reduce staff, what staff are they reducing and why, and how will that enable the agency to, execute its mission better, which is still, despite all the talk, on paper, to send humans back to the moon for the first time since Apollo. And when they did that, they had 36,000 civil servants. They reduced it afterwards. And that was, the analytical stuff you're talking about, Jake. Just the original idea which they ended up not doing, was of firing all probationary, basically newly hired or newly promoted individuals. That itself would have been the largest involuntary layoff at NASA since the end of Apollo. Except now they're actually trying to go to the moon, right? They're not ending a moon program. They're spinning one up. Yeah. And so again, it's like, how are they doing this and why? And obviously from this broad directive that came out last night, we don't, in a sense, we don't know exactly what decision metric they're going to be using. We're hearing lots of scary numbers in a sense from the inside, but obviously nothing is for sure. And I'll emphasize that this, what's called a RIF, a reduction in force, this is all much more by the book, less questionable in terms of, the legal authority to do so. This is all relatively by the book and prescribed procedures for reducing workforce. So, if they want to pull this through, and Congress, which so far hasn't shown in toto much interest in correcting this, could have a pretty substantial reduction coming our way.
Yeah. It's very chaotic, and there's like a lot of the impacts. It's the thing I kind of think about a lot right now is that you can't really have it's hard to make like a value judgment on whether it's a good move or not, because like at a like a really fundamental level, the thought process of trying to make the government more efficient is virtuous. Like that, both sides of the aisle would agree. Like, no, like if we can do the more or the same with government for less, like that, everyone thinks that's better, right? Like that's just like, if you get more value per taxpayer dollar spent, that's good. But the way it's happening is very interesting. Like in the I kind of call it like a forest fire style of doing it, where you just like burn it all down and then you hope that like the good stuff grows back and you get a healthy forest at the end of it. But like it's very disruptive in the short term, right?
Yeah.
The one thing I was kind of paying attention to was like all
excellent
that.
analogy. Just
Right?
so good. First time I ever heard you say that. Excellent. Stuck the landing on that one.
Yeah. The thing I've been kind of paying attention to was these like analysis groups, right? So the Planetary, you've got the Mars one is MEPEG, right? There's MEXEG
Meatbag
for
and
Mercury.
Meatbag and
Yeah, MEXEG for Mercury,
Jupes bag. Yeah.
League for the moon. You've got OPEG for there's all these different groups that look at different kind of planets, and they they're like semi-independent, right? Like they're not really like part of NASA, but they receive some funding, I think, from NASA and sometimes they get help with facilities or they get presentations from NASA and all these kind of things. There's a lot of partnership that goes along with that. And they were basically told to stop. And so a bunch of them skip their meetings. They only have meetings every quarter or sometimes even every year, depending on the group. And so like the productivity losses there are like, that's going to be the kind of thing that we'll have to look back on later to say like, whether this was a good change to the federal government or not. Like what was the short-term productivity loss, and is that factored into the equation of determining its worth, right? That's kind of, I don't know, that's where I started with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could even go to last night's orders and say, does requiring everyone who approves already approved contractual obligations of spending, does requiring them to further justify it every time a check goes out the door in some written thing, is that an improvement in efficiency or not? To me, it does not strike me as an efficient way of doing things, right? It's intended to try to slow spending. But again, contracts are already approved through a legal process, right? They've been approved. It's just literally just paying them out, or even just giving them through a process that's already been defined. And so it's in some sense, I worry there's like a certain Orwellian nature to some of the language that I find troubling, in that you're adding, in a sense, layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy and paperwork in order to dissuade some of these activities, right? That's the idea, to kind of reduce. The goal obviously is to reduce or to make it harder to spend money or to go travel. And again, for some people that might be a reasonable trade-off. The amounts of money we're talking about here are modest in the scheme of, again, just in the scope of government spending, right? You could eliminate every non-military, non-social service in the United States, and you would still have a little bit of a deficit left over at the rate we're deficit spending, right? So keeping a scientist from going to a science conference and saving a few $1,000s is not going to be, the make or break difference. But this is what is being implemented, and with a tacit acceptance of at least the majority in Congress right now. And so this is all happening with that uncertainty. Again, is this going to make that workforce better at doing what we are asking them to do? And it's an interesting analogy, the forest fire. Forest fires are uncontrolled, destructive, right? Obviously, a lot of my colleagues that were very affected by that just in Los Angeles. And yes, you can rebuild from them, but you have to actively rebuild. And what grows back may not be what it had before. I think that's the predicate of the philosophy of what's happening now, is that, it's that whatever structure is there is so ossified and broken and immovable, let's wipe it all out. We haven't seen that second part yet. What are you intending to rebuild it with, and how, right? There's a lot of discussion. We'll be more efficient with fewer people. And we'll use like AI, or, usually it's just like, we'll use AI-ish, and there's always some kind of like undefined sense of applying that, or software. It's like, okay, well, how? And, what's the process for putting that in, on what timeline? We just haven't seen that part 2 yet. There's clear, I think, just desire, I think, from a philosophical perspective, to shift a lot of this onto external contractors and commercial entities, which we can get into as well. But then there are just certain things that just aren't good matches for that. And I think that's going to be the big question. We just had a House hearing yesterday about Artemis, where there was a lot of support. I think we've talked about this before. If you're already dancing on the grave of the SLS, that may still be premature given the statements we saw from the Republican leaders of that committee and elsewhere regarding that program. And so if we do have then big cuts and they do end up preserving the SLS, they'll fall disproportionately in other places. And my concern is areas like science, which has no commercial. There's no commercial science company, right? That's putting out science missions the way that there is with rockets.
The congressional movements right now, that they're starting to have hearings, there's starting to be budget talks, and the things that Congress do are starting to be relevant after the first month and a half of primarily executive.
All Trump all the time.
Crazy too that they're we spent from November to January talking about the Republicans have both houses of Congress, they've got the presidency, they've got a Supreme Court that's friendly. Look at what's going to happen on this 3-branch of government sweep, and then it was all executive action, right? That's the thing that I'm kind of mystified by, is that it doesn't feel like it's most of these things are not landing particularly friendly with the Congress right now, and I think there's going to be some intergovernmental dispute when maybe as a person who's generally been concerned about the scope of the presidency in my lifetime, hey, maybe this is the moment when Congress is no, we get to do some stuff, right? We actually do still control things. Maybe this is the moment when they start creeping back. Crazy that it will be a same party thing that happens with. And that might be on specific topics, like we're talking about SLS, but that could be a larger thing.
Or the space station.
Or the space station. But, the fact, it's such an interesting mix politically right now when you have a president who is on his last term and, we'll find out if it's more or less likely that his vice president might run and win next time, but it's a one-term presidency right now, so that particular person does not have a lot of future power. People in Congress don't feel like they need to stay friends with that particular individual. They do want the support of his movement generally, but there's so many interesting dynamics. But I don't know, were you as surprised as I was that the first month really was completely excluding Congress, and now as we get into March, we're going to have Trump speaking in the State of the Union kind of address in a president's first year. We're going to have budgets being floated. We're going to get into the standard rotation of things that we usually see. What shifts or what notable signals are you tracking for the March time frame?
Well, I've certainly been, I'd say, surprised at the relative lack of Congress's own kind of protection of its own responsibilities, right, and its legislative responsibilities. Now, again, Republicans in Congress would dispute that, and they say that they believe what the president's doing is within his powers, and they will do what's within their powers. The big question is really on, I think, the idea of spending and impoundment, what's called the idea that Congress can appropriate money, and the president is claiming he can decide whether or not to spend it. In a sense, what's called impound the appropriated funds and just decline to spend it. There's some historical examples of this going way back. Nothing really in the modern era except till Nixon, and the law that we have, the 1974 Impoundment Act, was passed by Congress, big majorities of Congress, to protect their power of the purse, right? Kind of Article 1 of the Constitution. And the argument is being the president is supposed to execute the laws, and if the law says here's money to spend, your job is to spend the money. That will be, I imagine, some sort of Supreme Court decided thing. So I won't kind of hazard to say which way it's going to go. But I'd say, from when we talked last, and from, if those have listened to my Space Policy Edition prior to this administration beginning, I would say that I assumed a stronger congressional opinion than what we've seen so far. And that may just be the key word, so far. Right. I mean, we're still very early into this administration. We're 5 weeks, not even 5 weeks really into it.
Yeah. And
at some point, it's in a sense, the actions being taken so far, they're broadly popular within the Republican Party. And as the nation has become more, in a sense, polarized, there are fewer and fewer competitive districts. Right. And so, members of the Republican Party, even if they see some pushback or are a little uncertain by it, a lot of them are in just very, very safe districts. And it's actually a bigger risk for them politically to break with the president because then they could lose in a primary. And I've started to talk about this a little bit, but I think this is a really fascinating thing that we're seeing right now is that since the end of Apollo, the space politics have been defined by parochialism, right? Like what will this do for my district? I'm a senator from Texas. I want money flowing into Johnson. I'm a senator from Alabama. I want money flowing into Huntsville. I don't really care about the broader national interest of the space program. I may pay some lip service. I may care a little bit, but at the end of the day, money comes here, right? Because that's where my constituents are. We're seeing, I think, the first real potential shift of that, right? Where it may be more politically beneficial, particularly for members of some of the, in the Republican Party right now, who has a very strong and very popular president among their base, to say it's okay to take that economic hit in my state because that's better for me as to be aligned with this leader of my party. And if that occurs, if that fundamental dynamic shifts, then it's a really kind of a very different game for space and how it goes forward. And so again, and we haven't finished running that yet, and clearly we're seeing a little bit. There's still that lingering, right? Ted Cruz didn't seem super happy about deorbiting ISS really early. We're seeing a lot of quiet but real pushback against canceling the SLS right away. We saw some of that yesterday in the hearing with Brian Babin, who's the chair of the science committee from Texas, and so it's not dead yet, right? I think it's just a very different. It's much more of an open question than has ever been, because space has been generally one of those last bastions of, this kind of local politics trumping the nationalization of all other political ideas.
Yeah, I kind of thought I've been thinking about this idea too. It's like, where's Congress in these last 5 weeks? But I think I'm not as surprised by it as others are, because like you said, 5 weeks is I know it feels like a lot longer because there's just been so much news, but like it's just 5 weeks. And I think that, when we think about the presidential election, I don't think it was super surprising that Trump won, but I think it was super surprising that his mandate was so strong, right? I think that was sort of everyone was sort of prepared for the eventuality that, it could go either way. It could have gone Democrat, it could have gone Republican. Like, I think that was totally on the table as a possibility, but like the idea that he would have come in and just totally secured every swing state and done, and come in with such a vigor of a mandate, I think that probably puts Congress back on their heels a little bit, right? Because it's like, oh, well, it's not tenuous. It's not like last time where it's like, well, he just squeaked by with a couple of swing states and didn't have popular vote. Like, none of those excuses are good anymore. Like straight up, the guy won. He straight up won, like, period, And so if you're Congress, you probably want to be strategic at this point, because it's just like, Trump's really popular. I'm not going to say a bad thing yet. We got lots of time. I'm just going to see which way the wind blows, go under the radar, not ruffle any feathers, let them spend a bunch of energy on executive orders. Half of the ones I don't like will get struck down by courts anyway, so I don't have to put my political capital on the line for that. And then once the dust is settled, we can pick the battles we want to pick and then go to war, right? Like that seems like how I would approach it politically, but I don't know. Does that seem sane, or am I missing something?
No, I think so. I mean, I think that's certainly broadly the case. And then I would add into that, if you cross the president right now, Elon Musk will spend $200 million in your district to promote your primary opponent. Right. I mean, I'm not joking. I mean, that's one of the real unexpected kind of aspects of this, is that you have someone who is willing and essentially given free rein to jump into these situations like that and basically be that enforcer. And so that the question is then, will they, how and what battles will they pick, and what will they feel that is, anything like that, you'd almost have to say that they would be willing to lose a primary for to openly go against the president in a high profile issue. I think what you'll see is maybe what we're starting to see now, a lot of behind the scenes pushback, and, and we have seen things successfully reversed, right? The initial freeze on government grants was rescinded before it was implemented. We've seen a lot of agencies pulling. I think the other day they tried to fire a bunch of individuals from Veterans Affairs, and those were I think, canceled or trying to be restored at the last minute. You've seen people who were laid off from Department of Energy's Nuclear Safety Commission trying to be hired back. So there's some sort of pushback happening. It's just not visible, and I think that's the key: is that there's a visible alignment versus a pushback behind the scenes. And my guess is that that's what you're going to broadly see.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, that's different if you're a Democrat, right? You want to be very visible, and it's the way that these incentives work in terms of how the political alignments have developed is that Democrats will be highly incentivized now to break completely and be highly critical, which will actually make Republican defectors less likely to want to join them, because then they'll be seen as joining, a highly critical opposition party. And so it just that kind of that further cleavage of the partisanship, unfortunately, will just kind of push this into strange areas. But it's one of those things, again, where we do have to keep, I think, the big picture. And this is where, for the Planetary Society's perspective, right, there's a lot happening. Some of the stuff is clearly well within executive authority. Some, as you point out, others will be challenged and are being challenged by the courts. The one that I'm really concerned of is both workforce and budget for NASA. These two kind of normal sounding things that could have real long-term consequences, right? So we talked a little bit about workforce. I'm very, very worried about upcoming budget cuts to NASA and where they will be applied. Mm-hmm. And those aren't just coming from the White House. So we have a White House budget request that's due sometime in the next month or two. We're expecting what's called a skinny budget, in the sense that they don't have the full amount of time to put together a full comprehensive budget request. They may put out something in the next few weeks that is just a high level, here's what, top line numbers for agencies or key programs. We're expecting some pretty draconian sounding cuts in that would be consistent with what we've been seeing coming out of the White House and with workforce reductions. But then at the same time, you have what's called a reconciliation process successfully has now moved through both Senate and House, so they have to reconcile the reconciliation budget. It's a variety of these kind of internal legislative quirks. But at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is set themselves up to pass some substantial changes in tax code and other kind of funding issues, free of needing a 60 vote majority in the Senate, right? So they only need a simple majority. And to do that, you need to, kind of balance a number of things around. We won't go into the arcane aspects of this. But what we've seen coming out from both Senate and House are calling for substantial, on the order of $2 trillion over 10 years reductions to the account, the part of the federal budget that funds NASA and other domestic agencies. NASA classically has not bucked the trend of that account, right? So when that pie gets smaller, NASA's slice has generally gotten smaller. When that pie's gotten bigger, NASA's slice has gotten bigger. And so, we have a two-track pathway then, right? We have the White House looking probably for budget cuts, and Congress presenting a situation where, by committing to larger tax cuts and increases in border security and defense spending, you just shrink the pot that NASA has to use. And at the end of the day, both of those align in a way that I'm not excited about, right? That you would have just less money for NASA priorities. And, again, would be, I think you can debate whether and how NASA should spend its money, right? I know that a lot of your listeners in your Discord and you have opinions about wasteful programs in NASA.
Our show content may or may not be mostly about that. Yeah.
I think the worst case scenario, though, is that what we end up is keeping big, expensive projects like SLS with a reduced budget. I think that's actually where the politics are probably most likely to lead to.
Yeah, that's like a worst case scenario, because it just sucks up all the good money.
I think that's the most likely scenario we're actually facing, because SLS has the most support. It has the support of the, SLS is overrepresented in states represented by Republicans right now who are in the majority. Mm-hmm. And NASA science is unfortunately overrepresented in states represented by Democratic minority, right? California, Maryland, and Virginia. So that's just that out of the gate is a bad dynamic to be in if you're a fan of NASA science. But also just like the broader geopolitical competition with China and the kind of primacy of human spaceflight as a symbolic representation of what NASA does and even just the clear interest of what Elon Musk and Donald Trump have been talking about of sending humans to the moon. None of those require missions to, Europa or Venus or, the scientific stuff that we're really excited about at the Planetary Society. And that, again, has no or very limited number of commercial ways to reduce those costs, right? Those are just, we can get into it, but I think there's like a fundamental difference of type of mission of science missions versus human spaceflight and other types of missions that make them really difficult to achieve that kind of savings in.
Yeah. The sometimes I refer to what's happening here is like this style of government change is, it's not the first time this has happened. I call it's like, businessman solves government, where it's like very much, oh, I will go in. It's how would a CEO fix the government is sort of, what's happening here. And it always feels a little out of touch to me, because it's just like, well, all the tools you have as a CEO, which is like my word goes and you do what I say and I have like ultimate authority, like that doesn't really work in a democracy. That's not how democracies function, right? They're slow and messy by nature because they have to involve a lot of consensus and public support. And I feel like science missions, it's like one more level of that, right? Where it's like, not only is this a publicly funded program, and so like CEO levers don't work in fixing it, it is also a really difficult. It's a program. It's really difficult to show the value of that program like directly the way you can with some other ones. Like, you talk about the post office or something. It's like, well, we spend this much money and Americans get mail. Like there's like, that's what they get. Like straight up, you can draw a straight line between the value. But it's like, what do Americans get when we find out that there are organics in a rock on Mars? And it's like, it's a lot trickier to explain, to draw that line to say like, this actually is good for you as a society to have this knowledge and what we can do with this, right? It's a harder one to say. And businessman fixes government doesn't want that nuance, right? It's a trickier one to sort out. So yeah, I can kind of see how that might be a bit of a trap we get into, right?
I'm going to push back a little bit on that, but I think that the fundamental communication strategy problem is there, because when they poll Americans in public polling,
oh yeah,
we hate mail.
Stuff is the stuff at the very bottom, right? In terms of what they think NASA should be doing. The very stuff at the top, it's Earth observation,
defense, right?
planetary defense, and science. Those are the top three things. And it's not they're not edging out human spaceflight. They're like 3 to 4 times, right?
Yeah, it's like a landslide. Yeah.
It's a huge difference. And it's a completely inverted structure in terms of what the political support is for those, right?
Right.
And so I think it's almost, I think that you have an easier time with science in the broad sense that I think science is an unalloyed public, or at least knowledge, let's say, even just kind of pulling back from some of the modern culture war stuff that's going on now. Just knowledge is, I think, widely accepted as a public good, right? It's good to know things about the world in which we inhabit, so we better understand it. And it can help us live better or be better or not get eaten by or fall into volcanoes or whatever, kind of situation you're looking at.
Prove that we're the best. That's also part of it, right? Like,
yeah, there's also like the action of science in the ideal sense is kind of an ennobling activity, right? That you're working together to better understand things in a systematic way. Space science in particular is often discovery science, right? Where you don't have a lot of opportunities just to, left on Earth to say, what if we go there? And you'll learn something brand new, right? Because you've just never been there before. Mm-hmm. Earth is so well explored that you don't have that as many options. And space science also allows you to basically validate, it's stress testing every theory we've developed just on Earth, right? Like, have we taken for granted some aspect of the domain here on Earth, whether gravity or physical or whatever, geologic, that we don't even know is a variable? So we test our things out there to say, do we really understand something? Let's stress test this theory. We got to go somewhere else. Does geology work the same way as it does on Earth? Does physics? It does biology? That's obviously the big question. So in a way, I think people understand that kind of maybe somewhat intuitively, but the problem in a sense is that science is smaller in scope than human spaceflight. And so the political coalition that wants to defend it is just smaller, right? Just by nature of it being, in a sense, more efficient. You don't have as many bought-in districts for it. And then there's just kind of just an accidental alignment of the political the representational like where NASA is.
Yeah.
I had this really great interview with Brian Odom, who's the chief historian at NASA, and he published a book about NASA in the South on my podcast, Space Policy Edition. And you realize every NASA center that NASA made as NASA has been in the American South, right? Every other center that is not in the American South predated the existence of NASA and was just incorporated into it, right? And so that was a number of reasons. Among them was the government policy at the time to try to economically revitalize the South and modernize it and create infrastructure and build it up. The presence of Southern Democrats in the Senate at the time, who how inverted our politics were, that was the case. But the result is that those centers tend to be human spaceflight related because that's when they're building it around Apollo. And these other centers that aren't just do other things. And so there's this fundamental just political alignment based on complete accidents of history about how the politics evolved in those locations. At the end of the day, that question though about why, we're doing, various things versus others, that's obviously been on my mind a lot. I do have, I've been monologuing a lot, so I'll stop, but I do have, and it might be a good opportunity to test this out. I do have a broader kind of perspective on, in a sense, defending the value of a public space program and what that gives us, that I've been working on from a conceptual thing. And I think that's a message that we need to talk about more, and not in a way that saying we don't need or don't value commercial or private space flight. It's that I think we're almost trending too hard. And I think that we talked about this the last time I was on the show, but this kind of focus on the efficiencies of the private sector, they're real. But as you point out, Jake, right, they depend on a fundamentally different mode of operation, a less democratic mode of operation. You can't go and, as citizens, you can't go and advocate to SpaceX, right? They do not care. They won't listen. You could try to convince Elon Musk himself, right? But then you're convincing an individual. And I think at the end of the day, the question to me is, private space hits on it's an individualistic mindset, right? In the sense that you have a very strong founder ethos related to most of these new space companies. They're representing, ironically, and it's a more emotionally impactful, internal individualistic opportunity, right? Settling Mars, saving humanity, doing these big kind of dreamy things that would never make it through the public policy process, right? But then in practice, they're relentlessly utilitarian and as I keep saying, it's great to have this incredible launch capability that SpaceX has given us, but someone's got to build the thing to go on the rockets, right? And they can't all just be things pointing down to send us, more internet signals back at each other, right? Like, if you want to do anything else, you got to build the thing that goes on top of the rocket. And so ironically, the public sector, which has the more bloodless, kind of so acceptable, policy-oriented, quantitative arguments for why we're doing things, is the sector that does the really truly inspiring non-commercial, let's go to Europa and look for life. Let's go to Mars. Let's go to Pluto. Those things don't happen in the commercial sector because you cannot justify them as any sort of profit-making utility. So there's an interesting tension between spaceflight has private spaceflight has this romanticized rhetoric around it, but in practice, it's relentlessly utilitarian. While public spaceflight has a certain kind of bloodless bureaucratic speak around it, but the application of what it does is truly romantic and inspiring. And I think that tension has yet to be resolved. And this is where I think we need to talk about, at least from Planetary Society perspective, this value of what does the public sector space program, what does that give us in a unique sense? And the unique things that it does, that's the thing to do more of, right? By definition, and go from there.
Are there like structural things though that you can look at to figure out where the NASA spend is? Like when we see the line item for SLS spending is $2 billion a year. What do we got? 3 billion?
2.5, 2.5, 2.6.
Like how much per year gets wired over to Boeing's account versus how much is captured within NASA's, and what is that part doing? Is like, are there things that you can look at if you were to take this on, right? And is that which part is the part that actually would be the better cut? Is it wire less money to Boeing or spend or capture less money within NASA?
It depends it depends who's saying what is the better outcome.
Yeah,
right?
I think in your framing though of like of getting
Well,
to
so
getting to the romantic application
Yeah.
process, because I don't think there's many people in the space industry that would argue like probably could do less in both of these departments, but
Mhm.
how do you actually
I
figure
think
out which part is the thing that is
yeah,
in the way
and the
of getting
framing
to the
thing, I
romantic
think this
part?
is where. Sorry, I'm getting excited, so I don't mean to cut you off.
No, I like excited Casey. Let's go.
Dram of bourbon now. Um, it's more of a function of, again, I think, leaning into the unique quality, right? And so obviously SLS is not something that is a unique capability. I mean, in some ways, technically it is, but obviously NASA or Boeing, through its classic contracting methods, they don't build rockets as well as the private sector. That's been definitively, I think, answered, multiple times now. And is that, if we're facing a situation of less money and wanting to be efficient, does it make sense to replicate that internally? And so that's where I would say probably not. And that money, whether it goes to Boeing or not, isn't so much the question, is how are you spending it? Are you spending it doing the things that NASA then can do uniquely? So at Marshall, if they want to keep that money in Alabama, and this was actually ironically the original proposal that Lori Garver did under the Obama administration when SLS was mandated, was saying, instead of building rockets, why don't you figure out like nuclear propulsion? Let's do that, because the private sector probably can't do that one. Can we do advanced, new types of propulsion? Can we do real serious attempts at long-term life support? The types of things that you really need that the private sector just can't really do, or you want to do first and then hand it over to them. That kind of cutting edge, uncertain research and technology development. That's in a sense how the money should be spent, rather than doing stuff we already know how to do. And you can actually probably utilize a lot of the same workforce. So it's, NASA generally, I think that's the number, something like 80% of the NASA budget for NASA just goes out the door to contractors every year, as it is, right? That even predates the current era of commercial space. And it's how that, again, it's just where it's directed and how it's spent. And so leaning into, I think, to the unique quality, what can we do that industry cannot? Where do we recognize that just the fundamental incentive structures of how we tell contractors to build a big rocket versus a commercial company on a fixed contract to build a rocket clearly don't lead to the same outcomes? And we can learn from that, right? And this is where, again, I go to science. And this isn't even to say that there aren't efficiencies to be found. But I think we've kind of established so far that the concept of efficiency is a bit of a misnomer in terms of what's being applied at the moment. It's about cramming down all sorts of spending on a relatively modest scale, but with real kind of overburdened consequences to the people, asked to do this stuff. Can we make that work better? And, we were called for that in our recommendations to the incoming Trump administration, is holding contractors to account, expecting more in terms of performance, and having a higher level of decision-making process and trying to reduce these types of burdens. But at the end of the day, again, no one else will send a mission to Europa except the public sector, right? Because there's just it's not even the sense, you can't even necessarily pay a private company to do that, because you're starting, in a sense, this is like the other fundamental difference of science, I think, versus other domains of space. Science, as we've configured it, at least space science, you start with the questions you want to answer. And then you work backwards from there to define how you build the spacecraft. It's like, are you going to answer these questions? And that leads you, that's why you have a spacecraft designed to answer the set of questions. You don't have multiple, you don't just pull a Europa clipper off the shelf, right? Yeah. And the domain is so different. Europa environment is so different than Martian environment is so different than lunar environment, that you don't really have an opportunity for scale in terms of production, maybe in terms of some subcomponents. That if you want to answer the big questions, you have to start with those and work backwards. Human spaceflight, you can build a lot of the same thing, right? You can build multiple Dragons, because every Dragon is basically the same thing. You build multiple shuttles, you build multiple rockets. They're all basically the same thing. You're printing to order, right? They're in a production line. You can get economies of scale that way.
Sometimes one shows up a little late, okay? Listen, occasionally we get a month or 2 month delay, and then you just start tweeting some crazy shit. All right?
Yep.
So back off of that.
or that, right? And so, science as an endeavor, has been fundamentally argued as a responsibility of the public sector after World War II. when we realized, it turns out having science saved the Western world. And so that's probably a good thing that we invest in as a society. And I feel to a certain degree, we might need to make that case again, that this isn't to say that there's not efficiencies or adjustments or problems in science. It's that there is a fundamental benefit by the act of doing these things in a well-intentioned and structured way that has profound benefits, not just to, again, the concept of knowledge. And here's my big pitch, that I believe it's like a fundamentally revitalizing societal force to be constantly inundated with novel and new information from areas we have never been before, right? That it demands a society contemplate and ingest and accommodate the new. And it's a counterpoint, it's a counterforce to nostalgia, in a sense, or ossification, or cultural decline, or whatever you want to call it. And so by constantly pushing ourselves, challenging ourselves by believing that we can do such things, and then having to handle and integrate new novel things, I believe is, again, this kind of ongoing rejuvenation to our society that really no other area focuses. And I keep thinking a lot about, space science in particular is the opposite of how most of our modern life has, instead of we're all kind of like down and in on our cell phones, right? And on social media, obsessing over what other people are doing. And space science is literally pulling us up and out, away from the individual into this broader sense of relation to the cosmos. And I think if you step away from that, and if you take a purely utilitarian, somewhat extractive view of what space can do for us, you actually lose something really important. And I think you lose something really important as a energizing aspect of the society and culture in which we live.
Great moment to plug the last time Casey was on the show, when we were dunking on space's religion. Just gonna say, it was an exquisite moment to smash cut to the last time you appeared here.
Well, so there's a difference between I think a blind faith, which I think that was kind of making in a sense of a belief about how you approach space, particularly human space flight.
That was like the human space flight. Yeah.
I mean, that's the salvation
kind of
deal. I mean, that's in a sense, that's the salvation.
You're more on the Saganism that kind of started the Planetary Society thing. Yeah.
Another way to put it, the listeners of my show maybe hear me talk about this in the last year, this concept of the sublime, which we are actually relatively denied that in our modern life, and our culture, I feel, start moving into this dangerous area of cultural criticism.
Listen, man, you're straddling this political divide, just an exquisite work of art. Like, I don't know if you're doing a hit on Fox News or what. Like, you're just killing it. So keep going.
I was gonna say, as eloquently as this has been put, I don't know how well it would play at a Trump rally. So I don't know how.
I don't know that it wouldn't. I actually feel like he's just hitting this right down. Well, everybody can listen to this and take their thing into it. It's kind of perfect.
If I would love to have the opportunity to be invited to a Trump rally and share the space, because again, I don't think this is a political perspective. I think this does touch on a lot of people's concerns about modern society, and that it is a bit too. You can go to degrees of whether it's nihilistic or just too relentlessly practical. I know that there's a variety of critics of modern cinema which say there's not enough weird stuff in the visual medium of film anymore. Would be an example of that. But the idea that
the same in this is a weird tangent, but it's the same in web design. Anthony and I talk about web design a lot. Is that it's super boring. It's all
derivative.
Yeah, it's all kind of consolidated to one various style, right? Like it's the three big things at the top, and I don't know, they kind of talk to you. I feel like it's converged right to this very bland practical thing.
Boring.
Yeah.
It's the new Northrop Grumman logo. That's the epitome of the design.
That's the one.
So what I was saying is this idea of the sublime, and again, forgive me if this starts getting like too heady and weird, but the sublime is you can kind of trace it back to, it goes back obviously further, but I've been obsessed with this idea of, obviously you've heard me talk about the real and acceptable reasons for spaceflight dichotomy that Michael Griffin wrote about. And I realized the other day that it's really an argument of romanticism versus kind of Enlightenment utilitarianism. And this idea that there is some essence of being that is not easily written down and quantified as this kind of romantic ideal. And real reasons for spaceflight are, in a sense, romantic ideals, right? They make you feel something. They make you, and feeling something is, in a sense, all that we have as beings who are alive in the world. And it's a very different type of knowledge, right? To have experiential knowledge rather than purely intellectual knowledge, right? There's some deeper feeling you have with an experiential knowledge. And feeling something about space, and I think this is why so many of us love space, is that we feel something about it, right? And tapping into that and embracing that as actually, again, this really important counterpoint to a culture that is just, I think, relentlessly practical, quantified, measured, right? Literally, in the sense that they're measured. It's so easy to measure, right, with data and digital. The digital world makes everything measurable. That we have fewer and fewer opportunities to experience something that doesn't make quantitative sense, right? And so, watching a rocket launch, I think this is why so many people park outside of Starbase and watch the launch, right? As you guys know, like watching a rocket launch is a transcendental experience, particularly if you've never seen one before. You lose yourself in the moment to something profoundly more powerful than you. And I think this whole area of things that I'm talking about, this is where I think the role of a public space agency is to provide that, in a sense. Like, obviously that can't just be the sole reason, but I think in terms of why that makes it distinct from a private one, is that the actual application of its ambition is in the areas of this, like, discovery based, pushing boundaries, exploration based. The thing that you put on that big rocket, right, is ultimately why you're doing all that work. And if there's nothing kind of big or profound or ambitious about it, if it's all just to launch another tranche of Starlinks so you can, access your crypto accounts from Bermuda more quickly, there's something lost to me, right, in the application of why we're going into space.
Yeah. Well,
damn.
I could
So
go on
is that
for
what you're gonna tell everyone? I know we could probably do this for 8 hours. And
are you working on your day of action, like, opening argument here? Is this when you
actually,
into a congressperson's
frankly,
office?
yes. I mean, this is
like?
We've kind of gone back to the drawing board a bit this year at the in our policy and strategy program, really thinking about. And I think this is a critique I would make of myself, that we've become so focused on, we want this mission or that mission, or we need to do this, that it's because we ourselves, I think, have lost that sight of, like, that kind of bigger feeling aspect of why we're doing this. And I started to think a lot about, people who come to advocate in DC, we're asking them, and generally because in the role of that DC policy sphere, you have to be relentlessly practical, right? That's acceptable reasons of spaceflight. But they're all there because of that fundamental experiential, they feel something about it. And that's a funny tension sometimes. But in a way, you're going to proselytize about something you believe in. And we want to give you the access and opportunity and confidence to be able to express that this is some important ideal. And again, what we like to believe we offer at the society is that we're not there to say, there's plenty of people who are focused in making sure we have a very vibrant commercial space marketplace, which I agree with. I think we should. There's plenty of people who are there representing the interests of professional engineers and aerospace experts and scientists. There are people who represent the interests of large aerospace corporations, but there's no one there just representing the idea of exploration and science, right? And so going there and being able to talk about this is a very important counterpoint, again, and a very important perspective for those individuals, elected officials, to hear. Because if we don't do it, we're just going to get drowned out by everyone else. And going back to this bigger picture again of, why do we have a NASA? Like, why do I feel like there would be something lost if NASA became just a pass-through agency for commercial space? And I think, that's what I've been trying to state, right? That there's some bigger cultural and individual relationship that we have towards a public space program, because its responsibility, it's back to the public that enables it. It's more than an agency. It's a mirror of the society back to itself, right? It tries to be an expression of our highest ideals, and it doesn't just want to do that, it has a responsibility to do that in a way that private actors don't. And so trying to find ways to share this bigger picture I think right now is very important. And so we're kind of stepping back a little bit from the specific mission focus that we've had and trying to say, what are these reasons ultimately that why we do this? Because I think it's time we really need to start talking about this.
So is it too late to join up if people have missed the call?
It is not.
What's the deal?
We have 2 more weeks, give or take. The 14th of March is when registration closes. We can just say it's you are responsible for getting yourself to DC. We understand if you can't do that, and we will provide online options for taking action on that same day with our members. We have an full afternoon, 4 hours of training, in-person training on the March 23rd. Where we will go through all of this kind of strategy talk. We'll have online training in advance. We'll have opportunities for kind of deeper engagement and prep beforehand. And we will book all of your meetings with your members of Congress. We will give you opportunities to drop in with other congressional offices. And we're putting together a special Planetary Radio live show that evening of the 24th. So we will have a lot of opportunities to do stuff and give you as much confidence and assurance and support as you need to go into these offices and just share your passion for space.
Love it. And as I always say, every year we try and have you on to talk about this, but we have a few listeners in our Discord who participate in this, and without fail, every time they come back with like this feeling of accomplishment and like connection with not just with space, but also with democracy. Like it's this kind of like lovely blending of like, I went out and made my country better. I mean, I made my society better today by talking to my representative and talking about this really cool thing, space. And that's always something that I'm just a dirty foreigner. I can't participate in this kind of. I might if I was an American, but so it's nice. I still have a love for democracy.
Canadian living in Mexico right now is double trouble.
Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah, I'm just.
He's gonna go lobby for lower tariffs. Is all you're gonna do.
Lower tariffs. Yeah, that's exactly what I would love. Just step off is what I would say.
Yeah.
No, but,
that and crypto. You're like, these are both my interests.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, people really generally have a really positive experience, and it does make you feel, it does change your relationship a bit to your elected officials, and you're walking through the halls of Congress.
It's so easy to be cynical about politics, and so it's really nice to have a thing we can point to where it's like, this is the virtue and the joy of a democratic political process that you could be a part of, right? So,
and what's amazing too is that we have to constantly remind the people that we go see in these offices that the people who you see before you, the people who came to Washington, D.C. on their own dime, they have no financial interest in what we're advocating for. We will not get paid. We will not have careers from this for the most part. We will not get a big fat contract. They have a hard time processing that, frankly, a lot of the time. They just do not realize it's hard for them to understand that people could care about space this much and just go because you care. And that's actually a really powerful message in and of itself. Like your very presence shows something, right? And that does not happen for many other topics. And so that's what gives it such, and the fact that when we do this, this is the largest advocacy event of its kind. And it's for people who don't have any fiduciary benefit that comes from these policies we're advocating for. So it's really unique in that sense, and people tend to have a very positive experience, even if the and I should even if it doesn't go our way at the end, right? I mean, that's the end of the day. We're not guaranteeing.
That's democracy, baby.
But by not trying, right? You want to be there to at least try, and I think it's if we've already that classic phrase of like, if you're not on the at the table, you're on the menu, and that's basically true.
Yeah. Well, Casey, this has been lovely. Another great sermon from the great Casey Dreier.
Join me every month at my Space Policy Edition Increasingly Sermon. I try not to monologue so much, but I'm pretty. My head's been in this quite a bit, so thanks.
That's why we have you here.
We needed it. We needed it.
Yeah.
we got our junk out last time, so this is we needed the Casey take direct to our ears. So this delivered. Relevant show next week too, Jake. Highly relevant.
Talking about getting the joy and inspiration of science. We have Dante Loretta coming on next week to talk about OSIRIS-REx, and there's been some great new results from these samples from an asteroid, a place we've never gone before, and we brought a piece back for us to look at in great detail. So we're gonna have it straight from the horse's mouth. It's gonna be good.
And I'm looking at the
Ask
calendar
him
right now,
about
so
the
that is
Osiris
actually what we're
Apex.
doing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, dude.
And the funding challenges that they're having, trying
Yes.
to make sure that they have scientists for that when it flies by Apophis, as we were reminded.
Well, it's not the hot killer asteroid anymore, though. So
I know. Well, I
It's
think
like-
we're back to Apophis
old
having
news.
a slightly higher chance now, right? We had a brief shining starlet kind of try to take the scene. Good
Didn't
reminder.
even get a good name.
Interloper.
Didn't even get a good name.
Yeah.
No. Jeez.
All right, y'all. Casey, you're the best. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.